What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with the Eternals, and technically this is part of the Judgment Day storyline. So for those of you guys who don't know about Judgment Day, this is the new event that Marvel Comics is launching. It's basically the Avengers versus the X-Men versus the Eternals. It's really, really cool. There are some stories that are part of the lead-up, so for example, like Benjamin Percy's X-Force, which we didn't actually finish. A lot of you guys didn't really seem to be feeling it. I wasn't really feeling it per se, but we can kind of pick it back up if for no other reason to kind of segue into what's going on with X-Force right now. I'm sure people in the comments will say yes, but I'm kind of looking more to the silent majority here to let me know if you guys are interested in that or not. But what this does, this second volume of the Eternals basically deals with Thanos' rise to power. Now, one of the things to remember about the first arc that we did, because it's been a while, right? These comics come out once a month, so it's been a little over 6 months since the last time that we covered the Eternals, that with Thanos' rise, he was basically brought back by Phastos. And the reason why is because the Eternals had realized that while they are technically immortal in the sense that they can die, but they're brought back by the Great Machine, which is still kind of an ambiguous concept in Marvel Comics despite all the years that it's been in existence, that the caveat to this is that when an Eternal dies and they're resurrected by the machine, a human dies in order for the Eternal to be resurrected. And that was kind of the story with Icarus, that there was a young kid that he was charged with basically protecting due to a kind of prophecy or a vision that he'd had of the death of this kid, but ultimately that kid ended up dying when Icarus died and was brought back. So that's kind of the struggle that Icarus endures. But the Eternals had realized this reality. And what this has done is it's created a kind of rift among the Eternals themselves. Those who are perfectly okay with it and those who don't like it, those who are avidly against it. And so what you have here, there's a few things that sort of go on. One is something called excess deviation. Now, this is a new concept introduced by Kieran Gillen. This doesn't really exist or hasn't really existed in the history of Marvel Comics when it came to the Deviants. Instead, the way the Deviants worked is they were always just kind of like a half-life, right? The Deviants had shorter lifespans than Eternals did. They were constantly engaged in struggle and so on and so forth. What Kieran Gillen introduces here is that among the Deviant population, there are basically Deviants that mutate, and that in mutating, they usually become some kind of a mindless, more violent version of themselves, and they attack and kill and even consume other Deviants. And so the goal here is, and what's really interesting, is you actually end up having Cersei, who approaches Crow of the Deviants. And the reason why is because with him being the leader, some of the Eternals are actually considering joining the Deviants and actually becoming a part of the Deviant cause, i.e. having their genes modified to where they stop being Eternals and they start being Deviants. Now, this is really designed to illustrate how far, how far in disagreement they are with like the role the Eternals play as it was prescribed by the Celestials. Now, that's one of the things that I do want to specify here. A lot of what Kieran Gillen is doing here is totally reworking the Eternals mythos in Marvel Comics, which thank God, because they haven't been relevant in like 40 years. Literally, getting anybody to care about the Eternals is like pulling teeth. Now, the thing about this is that we end up switching over to Thanos. Now, one of the things to remember is that Thanos had died during the events of Infinity Wars, right? That terrible ass story that Marvel did to try to tie into and try to capitalize on the Infinity War comic. Everybody knew it was garbage. Everybody said it was garbage. And so people read the first issue, then never read it again. So the thing about this is that Thanos was basically restored by Phastos. Now, remember, Phastos was one of the first Eternals that was resurrected following the mass suicide of the Eternals previously, and he was also one of the first ones to realize that a human has to die in order for Eternal to be resurrected. And so him essentially grabbing Thanos, who had previously been dropped into a black hole, essentially following the events of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 5, he of course snatched Thanos from that black hole, but Thanos is incomplete, right? He's basically a guy who's there, but he's not necessarily as powerful as he used to be. The promise that was made between Phastos and Thanos is that Phastos would basically ensure that Thanos could be resurrected by the Great Machine if he followed through with the campaign in order to ensure that Phastos' plan of destroying the Great Machine could basically come to fruition and that anybody that could stop them could basically be killed. Of course, the safeguard here is that if Thanos were to turn against Phastos, that it would lead to a kind of destruction of Thanos himself. Now, of course, with Phastos being the only one to have that information, once Phastos was killed and then resurrected, that information was removed from him. So for for the moment, there's no one out there that knows the failsafe on how to kill Thanos at all. Like, no one has that information, save for Druig, but we'll actually talk about that here in a second. Instead, what happens is that with this idea of Thanos basically, at least Thanos and Druig kind of launching a campaign with the Unimind, which is to say the idea of Zuros, who is the Prime Eternal, trying to maintain his role, and in turn, basically eliminating any and everybody who either stands against the Eternals by trying to join the Deviants due to learning the truth of the Eternals, or does not want to have their mind wiped about the truth of the Eternals. That what this does is, with this civil war taking place, this kind of rift, it actually leads to Eternals siding with Thanos. And the big thing behind that is it ultimately leads to Thanos being elected as Prime Eternal. Now, there's also a couple reasons for why this is done. The first is that unlike years past when we had been taught by Marvel Comics that Thanos was an Eternal with a deviant gene, instead what we're told by Kieran Gillen here is that Thanos was actually a pure Eternal, right? He was a true earthly Eternal, not an Eternal from Titan, right? Not a Titanian Eternal. Now, how far reaching that goes, only time will tell, because other writers may ignore that, some may choose to lean into it, but the thing about it is that Thanos has a rightful opportunity to become the Prime Eternal because he is a true Eternal. So it's kind of like somebody who's never been a citizen of the United States trying to run for president. You just can't do it. But then if you found out they actually were a citizen of the United States, then they would have free reign to give it a shot so long as they meet all the other criteria. That's basically what's going on here. And so with Thanos actually being elected the Prime Eternal, which is kind of nuts, Zuros turns on him, tries to attack him, and Thanos in turn kills Zuros for what's effectively heresy, trying to kill or trying to assassinate the leader of the Eternals, the Prime Eternal himself. And so that's when the question's asked by Druig, okay, now that you're Prime Eternal, we can access the Great Machine. What else do we do? And the first thing Thanos does is he kills Druig. And the reason why is because Thanos knows that what Druig likely did is he backed up the information Phastos had on the failsafe for how to kill Thanos. So Druig's aware of it. He knows how to do that. What Thanos does by killing Druig is he basically ensures that Druig will be resurrected. But by manipulating the exclusion and the resurrection protocols, he removes that information from Druig. So Druig now has no idea that Thanos has a failsafe and that if it's activated, Thanos can successfully be killed. And even Druig himself comes to that realization when Thanos resurrects him. But again, you do get a bit more discussion about excess deviation. In all honesty, that's not going to be an important theme until we get to the very, very end of this story. That's where excess deviation becomes important. It is a concept I want you to keep in the back of your mind in terms of deviants basically mutating and so on and so forth. But the big takeaway from this, or one of the big things here, is back on Olympia, where Thanos tries to enter into the Great Machine. Instead, he can't really bond with it, and he doesn't really know why. There's seemingly no information as to why it is Thanos cannot bond with the Great Machine directly. He's a true Eternal. He should be able to bond with the machine, and he should be able to basically die and then be reborn in a more pure form. So the question is, why isn't that the case? Why can't that be done? And so as a result of this, what you end up having is Thanos kind of going on this quest to understand why he can't bond with that machine, and even basically going and trying to find Phastos himself, because the idea is that with Phastos, with the Deviants, Phastos can be taken, Phastos can be tortured, and then in turn, Phastos can give the information to Thanos. And so that's why you have these Eternals that are residing within Lumeria, the capital city of the Deviants, having these kind of general discussions about joining the Deviant race and so on and so forth. And then Thanos arrives and then basically goes after Phastos. Now, what's really cool here is that Thanos basically initiates a wholesale slaughtering of the Deviants. He doesn't really wipe them all out, but it is an absolute massacre. And it's actually done by way of something called the Oceanic Watch, right? So what this requires, what we need to do here, kind of explain the Oceanic Watch, is we kind of have to dive back into a little bit of eternal history. And this is something that we talked about before in the previous videos, or at least in the previous video that we did, but I do want to touch on it again here. So what you had in the early days of the Eternal Empire, the Eternal race, is you had Kronos and Uranos. Now, Uranos was an Eternal who believed in actually just conquering the Earth and killing everybody there so that the Eternals would be the only inhabitants. Kronos did not believe that, right? Kronos did not necessarily follow in that philosophy, and a kind of war broke out between the two. This ultimately led to Uranos basically being forced to leave Earth, and that when that happened, of course, his people basically ended up being killed. And at least they kind of found themselves involved in their own civil war, and then they all basically died. What we didn't know, and what's actually being explained here by Kieran Gillen, is that Uranos and his forces were resurrected by the Great Machine, by the exclusion zone. And so they've really just kind of existed ever since. The important thing is that what you had was a third brother named Oceanus. And the way this played out is that looking at his two brothers, Kronos and Uranos, falling into a conflict like that, the fear of Oceanus is that that he could very much fall down the same path. In order to ensure that didn't happen, and what we didn't know is that the forces of Uranos were actually resurrected by the Great Machine. And when that resurrection happened, no one knew what to do with them. They didn't know if they should like keep them just in prison or what the case may be, because the fear was they could fall back down the path of instigating a civil war among the Eternals. So what Oceanus did is he actually brought them in as his own ilk and then formed the Oceanic Watch. And so in effect, the Oceanic Watch has just always kind of existed out there. And so they're described as a sword in a scabbard, or a sword in a case, you know, when they pull out that's on their waist, which is just waiting to be drawn. So whenever some kind of a conflict breaks out and it requires the intervention of the Oceanic Watch, who are by all standards of measurement the deadliest force among all the Eternals, they could be utilized. So I hope this is one of the things that you're realizing, that Kieran Gillen is wildly expanding on the Eternal mythos, that the group is much, much larger than we initially thought they were. Marvel's just kind of changing things, which again, kudos to him, right? They need that kind of expansion. They need that kind of change, because the Eternals have just been they've just been boring for years and years and years. But Thanos basically attacking all these deviants, right? Wiping out most all of these deviants. One of the things that happens is he tells the Oceanic Watch, do not be lenient. Any Eternal that dies here, we can resurrect. Death has no meaning for these guys, particularly for Phastos himself. We can resurrect him. That while Phastos does not retain the information on the Thanos failsafe, he still has all the information on how Thanos can be hooked up to the Great Machine. And so once it's all said and done, and once this massive conflict ends, that what you have is two things taking place at the same time. The first is that the Eternals and even the Deviants themselves don't really understand their purpose, right? The Deviants don't really understand why they exist. And even Marvel Comics never really explained why the Deviants exist. We never learn their purpose. In other worlds, on other planets, right, in other parts of the universe, for example, the Skrulls, we know how things played out there. That Skrulls as they exist now in Marvel Comics are the Deviant Skrulls. That the Deviant Skrulls themselves won out in the Civil War against the Eternals and the baseline Skrulls, with the dire race kind of going on to do their own thing. But in terms of Deviants on Earth, they don't know their purpose, which is really kind of the bigger question of what's going on with excess deviation. So the Eternals and the Deviants kind of working together intend to find an answer to that question. The second thing that goes on here is that in order to gain an answer to that question, they have to meet with a Celestial. But the reality is they can't readily find one to meet with, save one, which is Avengers Mountain. So this requires the Eternals to actually sneak into Avengers Mountain without being detected, because trespassing is not readily accepted. And if the Eternals showed up on the doorstep of the Avengers and said, hey, I know you guys are currently housed inside of a giant Celestial, we need to wake it up so that we can have a conversation with it. That's a horrifying concept. Now, technically, the Avengers Mountain, that Celestial's dead, right? He's called the progenitor, basically responsible for seemingly all life on Earth. That's kind of how Marvel explained it. But it's basically dead, but its spirit does live on. That waking its spirit up could potentially create all kinds of problems. And so that's kind of the main focus here at this point. You have that circumstance going on, and then you have Thanos' campaign. So what you end up doing is switching over to the Avengers themselves, where Cersei calls a meeting or kind of a dinner date with Namor the Submariner. Now, a lot of this is also Cersei being Cersei, right? I mean, when you've been around for 1,000,000 years, which is actually another huge change, Kieran Gillen revealed the Eternals have been around for 1,000,000 years instead of like the 30,000 or so that we're used to in Marvel Comics. But when you've been around for 1,000,000 years, right, you find ways to keep yourself entertained. And that's kind of what happens here, right? She enjoys the company of Namor the Submariner in a few ways, if you're picking up what I'm putting down. But for Thanos himself, again, trying to understand how it is that he gets into this machine, he ends up basically torturing Phastos. And that's a cool moment here, because it's not cool that he tortures him, but it's a cool exchange here, because what it shows is that Phastos is far more kind and reasonable than he would initially let himself on to believe. That he puts on this air that he's just like this real hard ass, he's this real tough guy, and that's not necessarily the case. That what Thanos does, where you initially have Phastos who just refuses to answer any questions, and Thanos asks Druig, like, how in the world do you think that we can possibly pull this off? And Druig's response is, well, I mean, it really kind of depends on how you look at it, right? You're looking at things in a very basic and mundane way. A lot of it's because your mind's been screwed up ever since you were dropped into that black hole. But the other reason behind this is because you have to have kind of a larger mind here, right? He's like, take for example, the hammer of Thor. He was like, Thor's hammer is supposedly unliftable, and I doubt that I could lift it. So the only way to lift the hammer of Thor is to apply sufficient emotional leverage to make Thor lift the hammer for me and to use it the way that I want him to. And so the larger point that he's making here is to say, sure, Phastos is an Eternal, and sure, Phastos has been around for 1,000,000 years, but at the end of the day, what is Phastos at his core? And at his core, Phastos is human. which means he can be manipulated just like a human can be. And so what Thanos does is he says, like, I'm the prime eternal. I have control over all systems of this machine across the world. And he says, this is the town of Little Hollow. It's a peaceful, it's a safe town. And this will make the machine create a plasma vent beneath it. Tell me what I want to know, or I will render 10,000 souls into charcoal. And the reality here is Phastos knows that Thanos will do it. And so he spills the beans and he says, I reanimated you and made you part of the machine in the few ways that I could see. But full integration, I never had the time to discover how to do it. So the reality is, like, those details are confined to your parents. Only Suisan and Alars know how to put you into the great machine. Only they know how it can be done. And so the reality here is that where Thanos finds himself so frustrated because his parents are dead, the response of Druig is, I mean, you could just ask them. They're 3 cells over. And again, this is another modification by Kieran Gillen, that Eternals never die, that Eternals are just resurrected. And that's exactly what happened here, that when Thanos had killed his mother when she was younger, when he had killed his father when he invaded Titan and wiped out everybody there during the Thanos Rising story arc, they weren't perished, they weren't dead forever, they were resurrected by the machine, and they've been kept hidden ever since, right? Just kind of locked in these cells ever since. And so you kind of do a little bit of a time skip where you basically have Thanos, who's just been killing his parents over and over again in order to kind of soften them up, and then in turn interrogate them, hoping he can find the information that he wants. Now, for the Eternals that showed up at Avengers Mountain, it is pretty cool the way this works, right? The Eternals have been around for a very long time, which means they're very capable in stealth and guile. And so they're able to successfully start sneaking around through the building itself. But one thing to know is that in the end, what ends up happening is it's actually Starbrand that picks up on their presence. Now, Kieran Gillen kind of plays it fast and loose here, right? One of the things he says, this entire area where they are is sufficient darkness if you know how to hide. This mission could be easier than they feared. However, the Starbrand is a planetary defense system. The Eternals of the machine are a planetary defense system. You'd think that this would put them all on the same side. You would be naive. There is a certain professional jealousy. So in effect, what Kieran Gillen is saying is that while the machine, as it was seemingly created by the Celestials to kind of resurrect the Eternals should they ever die, while that is a planetary defense system, as is the nature of the Starbrand from the last White event, the truth about it, kind of, again, playing a little fast and loose here, is that Starbrand immediately becomes aware of the fact that the Eternals are here. It's really kind of Kieran Gillen just saying, like, this is how somebody found out, right? I mean, it's not like they stumbled across a laser beam, right? When they broke the laser, it set off all the alarms, right? It's not anything like that. It's actually a pretty elegant system to use, right? They did set off an alarm system. It's just the alarm system of Starbrand. Now, the cool thing about this is, remember, Starbrand is still a very young girl. She's not nearly as capable as she's going to be later on down the line as her powers begin to expand. And so what happens is that where Starbrand is like, I see your shadows over there, that what ends up taking place is Sprite actually uses his shape-shifting abilities, because in the Eternals comics, Sprite is a guy, or at least he is now, as opposed to being a chick, in the previous comics. But says, Sprite literally says, like, I'm your magical sleep friend, Pooble Peebs. And so literally just tricks Starbrand into thinking, like, I'm your sleep friend, and so let's go hang out, let's spend time together. And Starbrand, being a little girl and being very naive, just buys into it and then runs off with Sprite. And so that leaves the rest of the Eternals there to initiate their campaign. And it's a cool thing, right? I think it's a cool little moment, right? It's one of those things that shows that Sprite is, in a lot of ways, one of the more underappreciated members of the Eternals, and that Sprite actually does have some pretty cool moments in the comics. But the other thing about this, kind of jumping back to Thanos and basically torturing his parents for information, the reality here is they won't give him any information. And in fact, he does the same thing with them that he did with Phastos, where he's like, this is the town of Little Hollow. Tell me what I want to know, or I'm going to kill everybody there. The response of Thanos' dad is like, better that they burn than we help you destroy more worlds. We're not giving you anything. Right? We're not giving you one bit of information. And that's what's so nuts here, is because all these stories are starting to come to a head, where Thanos is told by his parents, we're not giving you any information. That town can burn for all we care. Thanos hits the button and opens up a plasma vent beneath the town. So now it's just a countdown to when this entire town gets destroyed. Now, following that, you pick up with Ajak, who's basically communicating with the Celestial, or at least trying to talk to it. And one of the things to remember is that while she is communicating with its ghost, essentially, that Celestial Eternals are very, very particular, right? For Celestial, they've been around for billions and billions of years, right? So what is 5 minutes to us is an instant to them, right? To have a kind of ceremony where you communicate and you talk to a Celestial, it takes a while just to get through the opening conversation, right? To present yourself and to show that you're a person that's even worth their attention in the first place. And that's what goes on with Ajak, where she's communicating with the Celestial here and talking to it. It's gonna take some time, which means some time has to be bought here. Now, in order to ensure that this time is given to the Avengers, Kingo comes up with this genius idea where he's like, I'm Skulathar, the Destructorite, right? Just like this kind of crazy thing. Just basically concocting some villain out of nowhere that doesn't exist and saying like, my swords will destroy you, and I've traveled across a trillion dimensions to face the Avengers of Earth. I'm going to kill you guys. And the Avengers are initially kind of like, what? Like, this is kind of stupid. But like once they start fighting this guy, they start realizing, okay, this guy's really capable. Of course, it is an Eternal, but one of the things to know about Kingo is he's wildly capable as a fighter, right? Kygo, as some people also call him, but he's wildly capable as a fighter, right? I mean, just is like the fighter of the bunch. Besides Thena. Thena, I think, is the more capable fighter of the two, but Kingo's pretty solid in his own right. He's simply just there kind of buying time for at least Ajak to communicate with the Celestial. The reality here is it also draws the attention of the other Eternals themselves, Icarus and Thena and so on and so forth, because what they realize is that Thanos, having activated that aspect of the machine and getting ready to wipe out that little town, requires them to intervene in order to save it. And so while that's going on, of course, you have Kingo facing off against the Avengers and saying like, oh no, my earthly death warning sensors have a message. The town of Little Hollow is about to be consumed by fire. You should go, and so like the Avengers initially think like he's full of crap, but the reality is like they start to realize he's actually telling the truth, right? Iron Man chimes in and is like, no, like he uses his satellites and realizes there's plasma venting under that town. We need to go and respond. So they basically end up taking off, and this allows Kingo to kind of be quote unquote defeated by the Avengers in a last ditch move, which Black Panther realizes, okay, this guy's an Eternal, something bigger's going on here, right? Like they end up responding as well. And so what it does is it leads to a kind of fight between the Eternals and the Avengers when they arrive on the scene, right? The Eternals literally tell the Avengers like, we've got it sorted, you guys need to leave. And the response of the Avengers is, no, you need to tell us what's going on. This leads to both groups coming to blows with each other. Now, the cool thing about this, and one of the things that's interesting, is that Thena basically creates a kind of portal that whisks Echo away, because Echo is in possession of the Phoenix Force, and the Eternals know how powerful the Phoenix is, right? They know that it's not going to hold her forever, but they do know she's powerful. And so one of the things to realize here is that the fight between these two is pretty interesting. You don't normally see the Avengers fighting the Eternals very often. So you have Thor fighting Thena, you've basically got Carol Danvers, and you've got Iron Man fighting their guys, right? Iron Man fighting Icarus, which is really cool, to be honest with you. Like, I'm really excited about that. But then you finally have Ajak, who breaks through to the Celestial Ghost, starts communicating with it, and it starts spilling its guts. And when that happens, she ultimately keeps attacking it. Now, we're not told explicitly what Ajak was told by the Celestial. We're simply just told, or at least kind of given here, that whatever it was she was told was pretty significant, so much so that it reduces her to tears and is like, why did the gods make us this way, right? So whatever information she was given was pretty significant. Again, that information kind of feeds into the larger story arc of Avengers, X-Men, Eternals, AXE, and that whole event unfolding itself. As for the Eternals facing off against the Avengers, one of the funny things here is that once everything's all said and done and Ajak reveals that she gets her information, the Eternals are kind of like, oh no, you defeated us! And then, they basically end up leaving. Of course, the arrival of Echo kind of helps a little bit, but the bigger theme that's hit on here by Kieran Gillen kind of seems to be, if the Avengers are able to overcome the Eternals, it's because the Eternals allowed them to. Now, there is a little bit of caveat that goes on with both of these guys. For example, what the Eternals lack in comparison to the strength of Thor, they make up for in terms of their experience in battling, just things along those lines, right? So it's not as though they don't really possess the same kind of power or strength. It's simply just that we're talking about a situation where one group isn't so much weaker than the other as they're more experienced than the other. There's no discernible reason why they wouldn't be able to come out on top here. Now, do I think that's accurate? Not entirely sure, right? I'm not 100% sure that I agree with that. But the truth about this is that switching back to Thanos, because the information wasn't readily available or given to him, what he ends up doing is tracking down the way in which he was created by Suisan and Alars, because that's one of the things to keep in mind. Suisan and Alars, and even the Eternals themselves, and that's one of the things that Kieran Gillen is kind of building up here, they don't procreate in the traditional way, which is is to say, Suisan and Alaris did not procreate, right? They didn't touch naughty bits, and then like Thanos and Eros popped out sometime later. That they effectively created them, right? Just because of the fact that Eternals are not really capable of procreation. And that's one of the things to keep in mind, that the Eternals will refer to each other as like uncle or father or son or mother. It doesn't really work that way. Instead, the way this works is you kind of have more like roles, right? So the phrase father is more akin to like president or governor or like captain or something like that. It's a kind of hierarchical rank, as opposed to like, you are my biological father, something along those lines, if you guys understand what I'm saying. But ultimately, even after gaining that information, Thanos tries to bond himself through the machine, but he can't, right? He can't resurrect himself through the machine. And the reason why, when the question's asked, Thanos basically just kind of is sort of sick of it. The reason why, as it's explained to him, is because he's simply just mutated far too much. He's not what his parents made him when he was originally created. When he was originally made, he was a pure Eternal, albeit with a bit of the Deviant gene, hence the reason he looks the way he looks, or at least that seems to be the case. But the truth is that over the course of his life, for one reason or another, whether it's his own modifications, the modifications death made to him, whatever the case is, he's not physically, and even on a biological level, the same being he was. So Thanos trying to enter the machine and be resurrected is like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. It just doesn't work. And so ultimately, Thanos as he exists now will simply just stay that way, right? He's just kind of the Thanos the way he is here at the moment. And so what he ends up doing is, in true Thanos fashion, basically activates a kind of self-destruction device, or a destructive device that will ultimately annihilate the entirety of the world, right? It'll destroy the entire Earth itself. And so what goes on is the Eternals arrive on the scene in the realm of Titanos, which of course the Avengers cannot access. And the Eternals even say that themselves, right? Like, a world-ending event's being initiated here, guys. You have to let us go. We have to go deal with this, right? As much as we would love to stay and fight you here, Avengers, we have much bigger fish to fry. And what's going on here is a place that you simply just can't access, right? You just cannot get to this location. So a few things you gotta know. Thanos is back. He's here on Earth. We kind of brought him back. At least Phastos did, but the Eternals did, is how you're gonna look at it. He's a prime Eternal now, and he wants to destroy the world. So we gotta go deal with him. We know you didn't know. We probably should have told you, but hey, you live and learn, right? So it's like, we gotta go deal with this. So we'll see when we see. And they basically end up racing off to Titanos to deal with Thanos. So it's basically the Eternals themselves that have to face off with Thanos directly. Now, the funny thing about this is remember, even though Thanos is not necessarily as powerful as he traditionally is, he's still way beyond any of the Eternals here. He's more than enough for any of the Eternals, and he demonstrates that. Icarus is really the more capable, or at least the most capable, of all the Eternals. Think of him as kind of like the Thor or the Incredible Hulk of the Avengers, right? The real heavy hitter and the guy that can hold his own. But even he doesn't stand much of a chance against Thanos. None of them do. And it's only a matter of time before Thanos kills them all. But then suddenly, Thanos starts mutating and literally starts dying. His body starts breaking down. And the reason why and what he's told literally is kind of this voice that comes out of nowhere, and it says, I have been programmed so that if anything classified as the hidden armory of Uranos was ever accessed, which is what Thanos did to initiate this kind of world-ending event, it says I would activate Phastos' failsafe codes when the countdown reached a certain dramatic point. The order has a note attached to it. If you are hearing this, it is because you wiped my mind, presumably to make me forget to use the failsafe. So I left this little surprise to activate in case you triggered a world-ending event. That Druig, knowing it was only a matter of time before Thanos killed him and resurrected him to prevent him from knowing how to activate the failsafe device, had created a plan C to his plan B. And his plan C was this, that if Thanos triggered a world-ending event, which is exactly what he did, that it would initiate the failsafe protocols of Phastos and it would kill Thanos, which is exactly what's been done, which is an amazing moment. So Thanos is dead again. And in all honesty, I'm kind of sad about that. I miss the days of like Jim Starling in the 1980s when Thanos was just an absolute monster. But that's the comic book hipster in me that doesn't want to see things change. I mean, I could see why they did this, but I'm kind of tired of seeing Thanos being a guy that just sort of gets his cheeks clapped all the time by just any swinging dick. You know what I mean? Like, if Thanos is gonna get killed, let it be by somebody who's just a hoss. But with that being said, guys, there is an instance where the Eternals kind of fill in the gaps a little bit. They sort of present a few things to the Avengers, kind of let them know what's going on. They do stay hands off, right? At the very least, they fill the Avengers on everything that had happened, but they do kind of stay away, right? The trust between the Avengers and the Eternals is a little bit questionable. And it kind of makes sense. I mean, one of the universe's deadliest beings had just been running around Earth, and the Eternals just never thought to tell the Avengers, right? So, I mean, that's going to create some trust issues, you know? Like, hey guys, the Mad Titan demigod who once blinked out half the life in the universe, he was right over there for like the last 6 months. My bad. Right, that's going to create some issues. But the big takeaway from this, and what's kind of the big thing, is that following the death of Thanos, that Druig is elected the Prime Eternal. And one of the first things he does is he tells the machine, with the new Deviant database, can you locate what beings the Deviants have catalyzed? Where can we find Deviant DNA, i.e. anybody out there who was not traditionally a Deviant, who's been corrupted by Deviant DNA? And the response to the machine is, yes, earlier areas with Deviant-derived DNA have been highlighted. And what it shows is just kind of everybody, right, in some capacity, right, because Deviants exist all over the world. So the response of Druig is, okay, narrow down the search, run these filters, right, and give me like a new list, right? I don't want to know the Deviants that exist in the core of the world that are just kind of spread all over the place. I don't want to know about some Deviant that bangs some random chick or anything like that, because I don't know, like, she's into that kind of stuff. Like, I want to know Deviants that are not supposed to be there. And what ends up happening is it shows him 2 locations. The first one is the capital city of Lemuria, which he's already aware of. The second one, he says, zoom in on that island. There are a ton of Deviants there. And that's when the machine tells him that's Krakoa, the capital of the mutants. They've recently expanded to Mars. What Kieran Gillen and Marvel Comics look like they're doing here is they're changing the history of the X-Men and saying the X-Men are not the result of some X gene that's activated, that the X-Men, that mutants as they exist in Marvel Comics, are actually just deviants. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. I'm sure it's gonna piss off a lot of people. Thank you all for watching. I will catch you all later. Peace.